Harold Matthews sat in his favorite wooden rocking chair on his front porch, watching the warm morning sun rise over his quiet suburban neighborhood. At 93 years old, his hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they still knew how to properly fold the morning newspaper on his lap. The spring breeze carried the sweet smell of his blooming roses, making him smile with pride. Every morning for the past 47 years, Harold followed the same routine. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., brew his coffee in the old blue pot his late wife Mary had bought him, and head out to his porch to read the morning paper. The neighborhood kids called him Grandpa Harold, even though none of them were actually related to him. He didn't mind. After losing Mary 5 years ago, these children had become like family. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," called out little Sarah from across the street, her pink backpack bouncing as she walked to school with her mother. Harold waved back, his wrinkled face breaking into a warm smile. Sarah always reminded him of his granddaughter who lived in another state. After finishing his coffee, Harold put on his old gardening hat and carefully made his way down the porch steps. His garden was his pride and joy. Rows of red roses, yellow daffodils, and purple violets lined his white picket fence. The empty lot next to his house made his garden look even more beautiful in comparison. He had tried to buy that lot many times over the years, hoping to expand his garden, but the city never seemed interested in selling it. As Harold worked in his garden, his mind wandered back to his younger days. The medals from World War II sat in a glass case in his living room, but he rarely talked about them. Instead, he preferred sharing stories about Mary with the neighborhood children who would stop by after school. He would tell them about their first dance, their wedding day, and how they built this house together brick by brick. "Mr. Matthews, would you like some help with those weeds?" Tommy, a 12-year-old from 2 houses down, had stopped on his way home from school. Harold nodded gratefully. His back wasn't what it used to be, and Tommy had become a regular helper in the garden over the past year. "You know, Tommy," Harold said as they worked together, "every flower has its own story." He pointed to the rose bushes. "Those roses there? Mary and I planted them the day we moved in. Everyone said they wouldn't grow in this soil, but Mary had a special touch with plants." The afternoon passed peacefully as Harold shared more stories with Tommy. They finished weeding just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. Harold gave Tommy a handful of fresh cookies that Mrs. Johnson from next door had brought over, and the boy headed home with a big smile. That evening, as Harold sat in his living room looking through an old photo album, he felt content. His house wasn't the biggest or the newest on the street, but it was filled with memories. Pictures of Mary covered the walls, along with photos of their children and grandchildren. His favorite was their wedding photo, where Mary's smile could light up the whole room. Before going to bed, Harold walked through his evening routine. He checked all the doors and windows, adjusted the thermostat, and looked out at his garden one last time. The street lights made his flowers glow softly in the darkness. Everything was peaceful, just the way he liked it. Little did Harold know that this peaceful evening would be one of his last quiet ones. As he climbed into bed and turned off his bedside lamp, he couldn't have guessed that tomorrow would bring changes that would turn his quiet life upside down. But for now, he drifted off to sleep, dreaming of Mary and their younger days, while his medals gleamed quietly in their case, telling silent stories of courage that would soon be needed again. Outside, the empty lot sat quietly in the darkness, waiting for the chaos it would soon bring to Harold's peaceful world. The peaceful morning Harold had grown accustomed to was shattered by the loud roar of motorcycle engines. He nearly spilled his coffee as the first bikes rolled into the empty lot next to his house. Through his kitchen window, he watched as more and more motorcycles arrived, their chrome pipes gleaming in the morning sun. "What in the world?" Harold muttered to himself, counting at least 15 motorcycles. The riders wore black leather jackets with patches that read "Night Riders." Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, stood out from the rest. The other bikers called him Steel, and his booming voice carried across the lot as he directed his gang where to park. Mrs. Johnson, Harold's next-door neighbor for 20 years, called him on the phone. "Harold, are you seeing this? Should we call the police?" Her voice trembled with worry. Harold assured her he would handle it himself, though his own hands shook slightly as he put down the phone. Taking a deep breath, Harold straightened his collar and grabbed his walking cane. Mary had always said that most problems could be solved with a polite conversation. He made his way slowly across his front yard, past his beloved garden, and toward the group of bikers. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Harold called out, his voice still carrying the authority of his military days. "I'm Harold Matthews, and I live right next door." The bikers turned to look at him, some smirking, others just staring. Steele, who had been checking something on his bike, stood up to his full height. "What's up, old-timer?" Steele asked, walking over to Harold. He towered over the elderly veteran, his shadow falling across Harold's face. The other bikers gathered around, forming a half-circle that made Harold feel uncomfortably surrounded. "I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood," Harold said calmly, though his heart was racing. "But I also wanted to ask if you might consider keeping the noise down a bit. You see, many families with young children live around here, and—" Steele's laugh cut him off. "Listen, Gramps," he said, placing a heavy hand on Harold's shoulder. "This is public property. We can do whatever we want here." The other bikers chuckled, and someone revved their engine loudly, as if to make a point. Harold stood his ground, remembering the courage that had earned him his medals all those years ago. "I understand that, son. I'm just asking for a little consideration. Perhaps we could." "Son?" Steele's face darkened. "I'm not your son, old man, and you're not going to tell us what to do." He moved closer to Harold, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Maybe you should go back inside and turn up your hearing aid." The other bikers laughed louder this time. Harold noticed little Sarah across the street, watching from behind her mother's legs. Other neighbors peeked through their windows, but no one came to help. "I fought in World War II to protect everyone's rights," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Including your right to be here. All I'm asking for is some respect in return." Steele leaned down until his face was inches from Harold's. "World War II? That was what, 100 years ago?" He straightened up and turned to his gang. "Hey boys, looks like we got ourselves a real hero here." The mockery in his voice was clear. As if on cue, several bikers revved their engines together, creating a deafening roar that made Harold step back. His garden flowers trembled from the noise, and he could see Mrs. Johnson on her porch, holding her hands over her ears. "Have a nice day, hero," Steele said with a smirk. "Welcome to your new normal." Harold walked back to his house slowly, his cane pressing hard against the ground with each step. He could feel their eyes on his back, and more engine revving followed him all the way to his door. As he closed it behind him, his hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anger. Inside, he looked at his medals in their case, remembering the men he'd served with, the battles they'd fought. He had faced worse than a group of bullies on motorcycles. But as the engines continued to roar outside, Harold realized this wasn't a battle he could win alone. Not anymore. Sarah and her mother came to check on him later that afternoon, bringing him a fresh-baked apple pie. "Are you okay, Grandpa Harold?" Sarah asked, her young face full of concern. Harold patted her hand gently. "Don't you worry about me, sweetheart," he said, though his mind was already forming a plan. This old soldier still has a few tricks up his sleeve. Over the next week, Harold's life became increasingly difficult. The bikers weren't just visiting the empty lot anymore, they had made it their personal playground. Every day brought new challenges, and each one cut deeper than the last. On Monday morning, Harold discovered his mailbox knocked over, lying sadly in the grass. Letters were scattered across his front yard, some torn and muddy from the morning dew. As he bent down slowly to pick them up, he heard the familiar sound of motorcycles approaching. Steele and his gang rolled past, laughing and pointing at the fallen mailbox. "Need some help with your mail delivery, old-timer?" Steele called out mockingly. His gang members roared with laughter as they parked their bikes in the lot. Harold said nothing, just continued picking up his letters one by one, his aging hands trembling slightly. Tommy, his young garden helper, tried to visit on Tuesday after school, but the constant noise from the bikers scared him away. "I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews," Tommy said, his eyes wide with fear as the motorcycles revved their engines. "My mom says I shouldn't come here anymore. She says it's not safe." Harold watched as Tommy ran home, his heart heavy. The boy's absence left the garden vulnerable to the gang's mischief. That evening, Harold found cigarette butts thrown into his flower beds, some still smoking among his precious roses. Wednesday brought the worst pain yet. Harold woke up to find tire tracks running through his garden. The roses he and Mary had planted together were crushed, their petals scattered across the dirt like fallen soldiers. Mrs. Johnson found him sitting in his garden chair, staring at the destruction. "Harold, please," she begged, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Let me call the police. This has gone too far." But Harold shook his head. He knew the police could only do so much. The lot was public property, and the bikers would just come back angrier than before. By Thursday, other neighbors started avoiding Harold's side of the street. Parents hurried their children past his house, casting worried glances at the bikers who now seemed to be present at all hours. The peaceful neighborhood he had known for nearly 50 years was changing before his eyes. "Look who it is, boys," Steele shouted on Friday afternoon as Harold stepped onto his porch. "The war hero needs some fresh air." The gang leader revved his engine so loud that Harold's windows rattled. "Maybe we should give him some excitement, remind him of the good old days." The bikers began circling the empty lot, their engines creating a thunderous noise that echoed through the street. They rode closer and closer to Harold's property line, kicking up dust and stones that pelted his house and what remained of his garden. That evening, as Harold sat in his living room looking at old photographs, he noticed something different about his reflection in the glass of his metals case. His face looked older, tired, but there was something else. A familiar look in his eyes that he hadn't seen since his war days. It was the look of a man who had been pushed too far. Saturday morning brought the final straw. Harold stepped out to get his newspaper and found his American flag, the one he'd kept since his service days, torn down from its pole and thrown in the dirt. The flag had flown proudly through storms, winters, and summers for decades. It had been with him through the war, had draped the coffin of his beloved Mary, and had become a symbol of everything he held dear. As he carefully picked up the flag, Harold heard Steele's voice from the lot. "Oops. Looks like your flag couldn't handle the wind, Gramps." The gang's laughter felt like bullets to Harold's heart. That afternoon, while the bikers continued their noise and harassment, Harold sat in his study looking at an old address book. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been all week. He flipped through the yellowed pages until he found the number he was looking for, a number he hadn't called in years. "Enough is enough," Harold whispered to himself, picking up his phone. He looked at Mary's picture on his desk, then at his medals on the wall. Time to remind these boys what real brotherhood looks like. His finger hovered over the phone's keypad. In all his years since the war, he had never asked for help from his old military connections. But as another roar of engines shook his windows, Harold knew the time had come to make that call. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual quiet. Harold sat at his kitchen table, the torn American flag spread out before him. His weathered hands smoothed over the fabric as memories flooded his mind. Each star, each stripe held a different story. From the day he received it during his service to the moment it had flown at half-mast for Mary's funeral. "We've been through a lot together, old friend," Harold whispered to the flag, carefully folding it the way he had learned in the military. Triangle after triangle, his movements were precise despite his aged hands. As he made the final fold, a sharp motorcycle engine shattered the mourning piece. Looking out his window, Harold saw Steele and his gang arriving earlier than usual. But today was different. They were carrying spray paint cans and more bikes were arriving by the minute. Harold counted 25 motorcycles, more than ever before. "Hey, war hero." Steele's voice boomed across the yard. "We got a surprise for you today." The gang leader held up a spray paint can, shaking it with a wicked grin. Harold watched in horror as the bikers began spraying graffiti on the fence between his property and the empty lot. Crude words and symbols appeared in bright red and black paint. Some of the younger gang members laughed as they took pictures with their phones. Mrs. Johnson appeared at her window, phone in hand. "I'm calling the police, Harold," she shouted. But before she could dial, two bikers revved their engines so loudly that her windows rattled, making her jump back in fear. Harold felt something snap inside him. It wasn't the wild anger of the young man, but the slow-burning, determined fury of someone who had seen too much in life to back down now. He walked to his medals case and opened it for the first time in years. Inside, behind his bronze star and purple heart, was a small, worn notebook. The notebook contained phone numbers and names from his military days. Many of them probably weren't valid anymore, but one number he knew would still work. His hands didn't shake at all as he picked up his phone. Just then, a rock crashed through his front window, sending glass scattering across the living room floor. Harold heard Steele's gang laughing outside. "Come on out, old man," Steele shouted. Don't you want to see our artwork? Harold looked at the broken glass on his floor, at Mary's picture now lying face down on the carpet. He thought about Tommy, too scared to visit anymore. About Sarah and her mother, who had to take a different route to school. About Mrs. Johnson, trapped in her home by fear. He thought about his men from the war, the ones who never made it home. They had fought for something bigger than themselves, for the right of people to live in peace. Now, in his own neighborhood, that peace was being destroyed by bullies who had no respect for anything. The sound of more spray cans rattling outside pulled him back to the present. Harold walked to his bedroom and opened his closet. In the back, still perfectly pressed, hung his old military uniform. He ran his fingers over the medals and patches that told the story of his service. "Not today," he said softly, leaving the uniform hanging. This wasn't a battle that needed uniforms or weapons. It needed something else, the kind of strength that came from brotherhood. Harold returned to his living room, carefully stepping over the broken glass. He picked up Mary's picture and set it upright again. "Don't worry, dear," he said to her smiling face. "I'm not letting them win." With steady hands, he opened the old notebook and dialed the number he had been saving for an emergency. As the phone rang, he could hear more destruction outside, the sound of his mailbox being knocked over again, engines revving, and crude laughter. Finally, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah." Harold took a deep breath. "Jim, it's Harold Matthews from the 101st. Remember that favor you said you owed me from Normandy? Well, brother, I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a warm chuckle. "Harold Matthews? Hell, I thought you'd never ask. What's going on, old friend?" As Harold explained the situation, the noise outside grew louder, but for the first time in days he smiled. The bikers thought they were dealing with one old veteran. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Jim listened quietly as Harold explained everything that had been happening. The sounds of the bikers' chaos outside continued, but Harold's voice remained steady as he described the destroyed garden, the harassment, and the torn flag. "Those boys picked the wrong veteran to mess with," Jim said finally. His voice was firm with controlled anger. "Harold, you remember the Veterans Motorcycle Association I started after the war?" "Of course," Harold replied, watching through his window as Steele and his gang continued their destructive behavior. "You still running it?" Jim laughed. "Running it? Brother, we got over 300 members now. All veterans, from World War II right up to Afghanistan and Iraq. And every single one of them remembers what you did for our unit in Normandy." Harold hadn't thought about that day in years, the day he'd led a rescue mission to save Jim and 3 other soldiers from behind enemy lines. "That was a lifetime ago, Jim." "Maybe so, but a debt of honor never expires." Jim's voice grew serious. "Give me 48 hours. I need to make some calls. And Harold, don't let those punks know anything's coming. Let them think they've won." After hanging up, Harold sat in his favorite chair, remembering the old days. Jim had been the youngest in their unit, just 18 when they'd fought together. Now he led one of the largest veteran motorcycle clubs in the state. The thought made Harold smile. Outside, Steele was getting bolder. "Hey, Hero," he shouted. "We got some friends coming tomorrow. Gonna have ourselves a real party." The other bikers cheered, their engines roaring in celebration. The rest of the day passed slowly. Harold stayed inside, watching as the gang marked their territory with more graffiti and noise. Mrs. Johnson called twice, worried about him, but he assured her everything would be all right. That evening, Harold received another call from Jim. "It's all set," his old friend said. "I've contacted every chapter within 100 miles. You wouldn't believe how many volunteers we got when I mentioned your name." "How many are coming?" Harold asked. "Let's just say those boys who've been bothering you are about to learn what real bikers look like." Jim paused. "And Harold, I called in a special favor. Remember Captain Roberts?" Harold's eyes widened. Captain Roberts had been their commanding officer, a man who'd earned 3 silver stars for bravery. He's still alive. Alive and kicking, runs his own veteran motorcycle group now. When he heard about your situation, he insisted on coming himself. As night fell, Harold took out his old photo album. He found a picture from just after the war. Him and Jim standing next to their unit's Jeep, young and proud in their uniforms. On the next page was a photo of Captain Roberts pinning a medal on Harold's chest. The sound of motorcycles outside had finally quieted. Through his window, Harold could see Steele and a few others sitting around a small fire they built in the empty lot, drinking and laughing. They looked so young, so sure of themselves. They had no idea what was coming. Harold's phone buzzed with a text message from Jim. Everything's set for tomorrow afternoon. Got over 50 confirmed riders. Captain Roberts is bringing another 30. Just sit tight. For the first time in weeks, Harold slept peacefully. He dreamed of Mary, of their years together in this house. In his dream, she was smiling at him, just like she used to when she knew he had a plan. The next morning, Harold went about his usual routine. He made his coffee, read his paper, and even ventured out to what remained of his garden. Steele and his gang arrived around noon, more of them than ever before. "Look who's brave enough to come outside," Steele called out. "Got your hearing aids turned down, old-timer? Because things are gonna get real loud today." Harold just smiled and went back inside. He changed into his best shirt, the one Mary had given him on their last anniversary. Then he sat in his living room, watching the clock and waiting. At exactly 2 p.m., his phone rang. It was Jim. "We're 10 minutes out, brother. Hope those boys are ready for a history lesson." Harold looked out his window at Steele's gang, still oblivious to what was about to happen. In 10 minutes, they would learn what real brotherhood looked like. In 10 minutes, they would understand the difference between making noise and showing respect. "See you soon, Jim," Harold said quietly. "See you soon." At first, it was just a distant rumble, like far-off thunder. Steele and his gang were too busy being rowdy in the empty lot to notice it, but Harold heard it. He stood at his window, a small smile forming on his weathered face as the sound grew louder. Mrs. Johnson called in excitement. "Harold, do you hear that? There must be dozens of them coming." Her voice trembled with hope for the first time in weeks. The rumble grew into a roar that seemed to come from every direction. Steele and his gang members finally noticed, looking around in confusion. The first group of veteran riders appeared from the east, their bikes gleaming in the afternoon sun. Another group rolled in from the west, and more came from the north. "What the hell?" Steele muttered, standing up from his makeshift seat in the lot. His gang members clustered together, watching as bike after bike appeared. These weren't ordinary motorcycles. Many bore American flags, military insignias, and combat unit symbols. The riders wore leather vests covered in military patches and service medals. They moved with precision, like a well-trained unit, forming a circle around the empty lot. Jim led the first group, his silver hair visible under his helmet. He parked his bike and removed his helmet, revealing a face weathered by time but still carrying the strength that Harold remembered from their war days. "Afternoon, boys," Jim said calmly to Steele's gang. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." More veterans continued to arrive. Harold counted at least 60 bikes now, their riders standing tall and proud. Some wore Vietnam veteran patches, others showed service in Iraq or Afghanistan. Young and old, they stood together, a brotherhood forged in service to their country. Then came the moment that made Harold's heart swell with pride. A distinctive rumble announced the arrival of Captain Roberts. At 85, he still rode his own motorcycle, leading a group of 30 more veteran riders. His leather vest displayed more medals and patches than any other riders. Steele's gang looked smaller now, surrounded by the veterans. Their usual swagger had disappeared, replaced by uncertain glances and nervous shuffling. The contrast was striking, their messy graffiti and scattered beer cans against the disciplined formation of the veteran riders. "Someone want to explain why a decorated World War II veteran can't live in peace in his own home?" Captain Roberts's voice carried across the lot, sharp and commanding despite his age. Steele tried to maintain his tough image. "This is public property. We can." "Son," Jim cut him off. "Do you see that man watching from that window?" He pointed to Harold's house. "That man saved my life and the lives of 3 others in Normandy. He carried me through enemy fire when I was younger than you." Captain Roberts stepped forward. "That man earned the Bronze Star for valor and a Purple Heart. He bled for the very freedom you're abusing." The captain's voice grew quieter, but somehow more powerful. "And you repay that sacrifice by terrorizing him in his own home." The veteran riders moved their bikes closer, the rumble of their engines creating a wall of sound that made Steele's gang's motorcycles seem like toys in comparison. but there was no aggression in their movement, just a show of overwhelming solidarity. Harold watched from his window as more people gathered. Neighbors came out of their houses, drawn by the spectacular scene. Tommy and his mother stood on their porch. Sarah and her family watched from their yard. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his house, came out to see. "Look at their patches," one of Steele's younger gang members whispered, pointing at the veterans' vests. "That one's from the 82nd Airborne. And that guy was a Marine Scout sniper." Steele's tough facade was crumbling as he looked around at the gathered veterans. These weren't just bikers. These were men and women who had fought in real battles, who had faced real dangers. Their quiet confidence made his gang's attempts at intimidation seem childish. Harold finally stepped out onto his porch. The veteran riders snapped to attention, showing a respect that made Steele's gang shift uncomfortably. Jim walked over and embraced his old friend, while Captain Roberts saluted sharply. The gathered neighbors broke into spontaneous applause. Mrs. Johnson wiped tears from her eyes. Tommy stared in awe at the gathered veterans, their patches and medals telling stories of courage he had only read about in books. Steele and his gang were about to learn that true strength isn't about making noise or causing fear. It's about brotherhood, respect, and standing up for what's right. And that lesson was just beginning. The empty lot had never been so full. On one side stood Steele and his gang, their once intimidating presence now diminished by the wall of veteran riders surrounding them. Harold walked slowly down his porch steps, Jim and Captain Roberts flanking him like honor guards. "Mr. Matthews," Captain Roberts said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "would you like to show these young men what's in your display case?" His voice carried the same authority it had during the war, making even some of the veteran riders stand straighter. Harold nodded, and Jim walked into the house with him. They returned carrying the glass display case containing Harold's medals. The afternoon sun made the Bronze Star and Purple Heart gleam brightly. "Let me tell you a story," Captain Roberts announced, addressing Steele's gang. It was June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. While most of us were pinned down by enemy fire, this man, he pointed to Harold, ran out 5 times to drag wounded soldiers to safety. The neighborhood had grown completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping to listen. Steele's gang members shifted uncomfortably, some removing their sunglasses, others staring at the ground. "One of those soldiers," Jim continued, his voice thick with emotion, "was me. I was 18, bleeding out on that beach. Harold didn't know me, but he risked his life to save mine. That's what real brotherhood looks like." A young woman from Steele's gang stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Harold's medals. "My grandfather died at Normandy," she said quietly. "He might have been one of the men you tried to save." Harold looked at her kindly. "What was his name?" "James Collins," she replied, her voice trembling. Harold's eyes widened. "I remember Jim Collins. Brave man. Helped me rescue 2 others before he was hit." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "He made me promise to tell his family he wasn't afraid." The young woman covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Steele reached for her arm, but she pulled away from him. "I'm done," she announced, removing her gang jacket. "My grandfather gave his life fighting real battles. We've been here terrorizing one of his brothers in arms." She walked over to Harold and hugged him tightly. Her action broke something in the group. Another gang member, a young man with military-style tattoos, stepped forward. "I served in Afghanistan," he admitted, looking ashamed. "I let myself forget what it means to be a warrior, what it means to have honor." He too removed his gang jacket. Steele watched as his group began to crumble. Some members simply walked to their bikes and rode away. Others stayed, but moved to stand near the veteran riders, drawn by the authentic brotherhood they represented. Captain Roberts approached Steele, who stood alone now, trying to maintain his tough image. "Son, you have 2 choices here," the captain said firmly. "You can leave and never come back, or you can learn what real respect means. Your choice." Steele looked around at the veterans, at Harold's medals, at his former gang members who had chosen honor over intimidation. For the first time, he looked young and uncertain. I didn't know," Steele said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "about any of this, about who you were." He turned to Harold. "I'm sorry, sir. I was wrong." Harold walked over to Steele, moving slowly but purposefully. The young man seemed to hold his breath as the old veteran approached. "In the war," Harold said, his voice gentle but firm, "I learned that the measure of a man isn't in how much fear he can cause, but in how much good he can do." He looked at Steele's bike. "Those machines you ride, they could be used to help people, to build something meaningful." Jim stepped forward. "Our Veterans Motorcycle Club does charity rides, escorts for fallen soldiers, support for military families. We could always use more riders who want to make a difference." Steele looked at his bike, then at the veteran riders with their proud patches and sense of purpose. Finally, he looked at Harold. Would you tell me more about Normandy, sir? What real courage looks like?" The tension in the air dissolved. Neighbors who had been watching began to emerge from their houses. Mrs. Johnson appeared with a tray of lemonade. Tommy ran up to look at the veterans' motorcycles, his eyes wide with wonder. Harold smiled, seeing not an enemy now, but a young man ready to learn a better way. "Come inside, son," he said, gesturing to his house. "I got some stories to tell you." 1 month had passed since the day the veteran riders arrived. Harold's garden, once trampled and destroyed, was now bursting with new life. But the hands tending to the roses weren't just his anymore. "Is this deep enough for the new rosebush, Mr. Matthews?" Steele asked, wiping sweat from his forehead as he dug a hole in the garden. He had traded his gang leather for a simple work shirt, and his once intimidating demeanor had been replaced by an earnest desire to learn. Harold inspected the hole and nodded approvingly. "Perfect depth. Mary always said roses need room for their roots to grow strong." He looked around his transformed yard with pride. The empty lot that had once been a source of trouble was now becoming a community garden. Every Saturday, members of the Veterans Motorcycle Club came to help. Today, Jim and Captain Roberts were supervising as former gang members worked alongside neighborhood volunteers. The sound of motorcycle engines still filled the air occasionally, but now they brought smiles instead of fear. "Steele, tell Harold about what you're planning," Jim called out as he helped another volunteer set up a bench in the new garden. Steele smiled, something that came easier to him these days. "We're organizing a charity ride next month, sir, for the Children's Hospital. Some of the kids there, they're fighting battles as brave as any soldier." Harold watched as Tommy, no longer afraid, showed Sarah how to plant sunflower seeds. The children had returned to the neighborhood, filling it with the sounds of laughter instead of revving engines. "Did you hear what Steele did last week?" Mrs. Johnson asked, bringing out a tray of cookies for the volunteers. He and some of the other boys escorted a fallen soldier's funeral procession. Their bikes lined the whole route to the cemetery. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken patience, understanding, and most importantly, stories. Every evening for the first 2 weeks, Harold had sat with Steele and others who wanted to learn, sharing his experiences from the war. Not the glorified Babel stories, but the real lessons about brotherhood, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right. Mr. Matthews called the young woman who had first stepped forward that day, the one whose grandfather had died at Normandy. "We found something special for your flagpole." She and 2 other former gang members carefully unfolded a new American flag, larger and brighter than his old one. "We had it blessed by the chaplain at the Veterans Memorial," she explained, her eyes shining with pride. "And look, it's the same size as the ones they fly at Normandy." As they raised the new flag together, Harold noticed something remarkable. The graffiti that had covered the fences was gone, replaced by a beautiful mural. It showed scenes of veterans from different eras helping their communities, with the words, "Honor, Service, Brotherhood," painted in dignified letters. Captain Roberts, watching the flag rise, spoke softly. "You know, Harold, what you did here was as brave as anything we did in the war. You chose understanding over anger, teaching over punishment." The empty lot had been transformed into something beautiful. Flower beds lined newly built walkways, and benches offered places for people to sit and enjoy the peace. A small memorial stone near the entrance read, "Dedicated to all who serve, in war and in peace." Steele approached Harold, holding something in his hands. "Sir, the guys and we wanted you to have this." He handed over a leather vest, similar to those worn by the veteran riders. On the back was a new patch, showing the garden with a soldier's helmet resting on a rose bush. Below it read, "Harold's Garden, where brotherhood blooms." Harold ran his fingers over the patch, remembering Mary's words about how gardens could heal any hurt. She would have loved seeing this: former enemies working together, a community united, beauty growing from conflict. As the sun began to set, the volunteers gathered around Harold's porch for a group photo. Steele and his friends stood proudly in their new charity ride shirts. The veteran riders, including Jim and Captain Roberts, wore their patches with honor. Neighborhood families, including Tommy, Sarah, and their parents, crowded in close. Harold sat in the middle, wearing his new vest, the evening light catching the medals in his display case through the window behind them. Mrs. Johnson counted down. 3, 2, 1. Brotherhood. Everyone called out together, their voices mixing with the sound of birds singing in the new garden. Looking at the scene before him, Harold smiled. His peaceful home hadn't just been restored. It had grown into something even more beautiful, a place where old soldiers could share their wisdom, where young people could learn about real strength, and where a garden could teach lessons about growth, respect, and the true meaning of brotherhood.